I want to do this session on interviewing. The most fascinating story of an interview that I've ever read is Oriana Fallaci's account of interviewing the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in September 1979. That was just a few weeks before Iran seized hostages in the American embassy in Tehran, which sparked a huge crisis at the time. Oriana Fallaci specialized in interviews and in the Q&A or question and answer format. And so we can learn about interviewing by studying her interviews because we have the transcripts. You know, if I'm ever allowed to do a whole course in interviewing at this university, which I think we need, but which will never happen, the first book on the course would be a collection of interviews by Fallaci. How did Fallaci conduct an interview to get revealing answers from the most powerful people on the planet? The time of her interview with the Ayatollah Khomeini came at a historic moment in world history and also at a volatile moment in the personal history of Fallaci. At that time, in 1979, Fallaci felt her life had been disrupted and she was tormented with doubts about herself. She was depressed because her husband, who she met in an interview in Greece just after he had been released as a political prisoner, her husband died in a car accident in 1976 that Fallaci thought was an assassination. Her mother at that time was also dying with cancer. For 2 years at that time, 1976, Fallaci withdrew from journalism, and as her personal therapy, she wrote a book about her dead husband called A Man. In this period of personal disruption and doubt, she said, quote, "You are only sure of your own doubts and your own solitude," end quote. So she was pared down to the essentials as a human being. After this period of mourning and doubt, Fallaci decided to return to the world and to journalism with renewed fervor. And though that return was with the interviews with Khomeini and Gaddafi, that is, these were important, powerful men, but Fallaci also felt that personally she needed to interview these two difficult and powerful men in order to find her own sense of balance and stability and understanding in life. So in a sense, in these interviews, she is interrogating her own doubts, and she doubts herself about the process. Now, in terms of interviewing, don't think of an interview in journalism as a typical journalist asking a typical source, typical questions, and getting typical answers. That is the impression you might get from a textbook, but real life is not like that. Interviews are infinitely different because of the variables. And the reason is because people are the variables. People are all different. Every journalist is different, and every source is different, and the circumstances of every interview is different. So think of the American Marie Colvin interviewing PLO leader Yasser Arafat at moments of crisis in world history. Or think of the Italian Oriana Fallaci from a basically Christian European culture interviewing the Ayatollah Khomeini from a Muslim Arabic culture. Those are extreme variables. Also remember that the quality of a story in journalism comes from the quality of the interviews. A superficial interview results and superficial material to work with, and you can never get beyond that superficiality when you're writing the story. So in this class, I suggest you challenge yourself with the opportunity you have to do interviews. You're given an incentive in this course to do interviews that you might not do otherwise. And that's an opportunity to challenge yourself in interviewing and to see what you can get out of yourself and get out of an interview. An interview that achieves some depth gives deeper material to work with, and Oriana Fallaci was determined to get to that depth. And so we want to study her to see how she did it. So like I said, Oriana Fallaci interviewed the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in September 1979, just a few weeks before Iran seized hostages in the American embassy in Tehran, and that created a huge crisis in the world. It was a huge accomplishment interviewing Khomeini because Fallaci was the first female journalist to interview Khomeini. And after the interview was published, Khomeini publicly denounced Fallaci, and posters with her picture denouncing her were posted all over Tehran. Fallaci got the interview with Khomeini partly because she was a hero in Iran for her interview with the Shah of Iran in 1973, before a revolution against him began in 1979. In 1979, in the midst of that revolution, Khomeini, who'd been exiled, returned to Iran to take over. 2 months later, after Fallaci's interview, the hostages were taken at the American embassy in Tehran, which is when Mike Wallace went to Tehran to interview Khomeini in November 1979, a famous interview. And that's when Mike Wallace found a way to ask Khomeini this explosive question: why are you crazy? And we've looked at that process previously. So 2 months before the Mike Wallace interview, 2 months before, in September 1979, when Fallaci arrived to interview Khomeini, her interview with the Shah had been translated and printed widely. So she was a hero first, and then after the interview, she was a villain. But it was the interview with the Shah, who was disliked in Iran, that initially opened doors for Fallaci and gave her power because of the animosity in Iran towards the Shah. In turn, because of Fallaci's interview with Khomeini, she got an interview the same year with Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in Libya because of the animosity between Libya and Iran. The Gaddafi interview is another remarkable interview by Oriana Fallaci. How do you interview a crazy tyrant? When you study that interview, Gaddafi seems to want to be interviewed by Fallaci because Fallaci has shown her power in Libya by apparently defeating Khomeini in the interview. For Gaddafi, the interview with Fallaci that he's going to do with Fallaci is a contest to prove his power to dominate a famous female journalist who has humbled Khomeini. It may also have a tinge of sexual politics. By Gaddafi thinking he can defeat the female Western journalist who defeated Khomeini, Gaddafi would also be defeating the power of the West in its liberation of women. So it's likely that Gaddafi saw a symbolic opportunity in the interview he was going to do with Oriana Fallaci. Now, as you see from reading the Marie Colvin biography, Gaddafi seems to want to be interviewed by female Western journalists. The way he behaves with Fallaci in 1979 is similar how he behaves with Marie Colvin years later. It almost feels like an attempt at sexual conquest, and yet Gaddafi doesn't seem to follow through. And so that doesn't seem to be his ultimate intent. It may be that he wants to demonstrate his power to dominate and symbolic power to dominate the West. Remember that 1979, the year of Oriana Fallaci's interviews with both Khomeini and Gaddafi, that was the year the West started to engage in conflict with Muslim countries. And so Fallaci was there just as that fuse was being lit. And, once that fuse is lit, it's lasted for such a long time. Remember also that it made the career of Marie Colvin that she was able to interview Gaddafi in 1986 when other journalists couldn't. And Marie Colvin turned 30 that year. Her biography says that one of the journalists she admired was Oriana Fallaci, the Italian journalist who succeeded in interviewing so many world leaders, including tyrants and dictators. Oriana Fallaci's career as a journalist was made by her ability to get access to inaccessible world leaders, including tyrants and dictators, and being fearless in asking them dangerous questions. The test of character for Fallaci was courage, honesty, and rationality. Her favorite theme in an interview was exploring how the powerful use their power. To understand the themes in an interview with Oriana Fallaci, it helps to know a little bit of the history of Fallaci. Fallaci was born in Italy in 1929, and while she was growing up as a child during the Second World War, her family was in the Italian Democratic Resistance, that is, the underground resistance in Italy. And of course, that was very dangerous for the Fallaci family. Fallaci herself participated in the resistance as a child. In her career as a journalist, it sometimes seems like she is still a member of the resistance, fighting tyranny with interviews, even the tyranny of the West. Her collection of interviews called Interviews with History and Conversations with Power was published in 2011, 5 years after her death in 2006. That collection, which is a superb collection, has 14 interviews with world leaders, including Robert Kennedy, Henry Kissinger, Yasser Arafat, who was also interviewed by Marie Colvin, Khomeini, and Gaddafi. Besides her interviews, Fallaci also published books, some nonfiction narratives, and some fiction based on her experiences. Her writings were translated into 21 languages. The question and answer format. We can learn about interviewing from Oriana Fallaci because she published in the question and answer format, not the news story format. And we can also learn from Fallaci because the narrative in the 2011 collection it includes the backstory of the interview with the interview embedded. So this interview collection is rich in helping us understand the dynamic of the interview as Oriana Fallaci conducted it, and also the background circumstances. A typical news story is preoccupied with what happened. The what is where the news value of the impact and magnitude lie. The who is often secondary to the what, or the who is part of the human color that allows the audience to connect with the what. And that is what Marie Colvin does very well. Marie Colvin blends what with who. But the Q&A format is preoccupied with the who over the what. A person involved with a what is being interviewed. The person being interviewed has the power to do things. The person with power has either done something or can do something. So we want to know the intentions, the character, and the state of mind of the person with power, and we want the interview to reveal those things. Both Khomeini and Gaddafi, at the time of the interviews, are powerful leaders whose decisions affect the lives of people in their countries and around the world. So we want to know the mind behind this power. Thus, we see the dynamic of the interview, the way Fallaci interacts with her source, and we get the backstory of the interview. Two elements you don't typically get in a news story. We see what readers don't see in a typical news story. We see what readers are blind to in a typical news story. Even a news feature by Marie Colvin, which is personalized to a degree. So if we're trying to understand journalism and improve ourselves as journalists, when we read news stories, we're missing the interview. And that interview is so important, and that's the value of this collection of Oriana Fallaci, that we can see the backstory of the interview. The typical news story, we're blind to that. That's edited out. In a news story, we don't see the questions that are asked. In a Q&A, we see the questions are asked and the response. We see the interview as a narrative form between the journalist and the source, unlike a conventional news story where the journalist and the questions are not part of the story. So with Fallaci, we also see the backstory of the interview. We see the difficult problems of her getting the interview, and this is a good reminder for you. Don't expect in a career as journalist for it to be easy to get interviews. Don't expect it to be easy to conduct interviews. So in the Fallaci collection, we see the backstory, we see the difficult problem of getting the interview. And Fallaci is really exceptionally honest and courageous in how she tells her backstory. She analyzes her own behavior, complete with her own mistakes and character flaws. She even examines how she was examining the process of the interview while she was conducting the interview and trying to adjust during the interview. We actually see Fallaci questioning herself, asking herself questions, digging deeper into her own thinking and process. Fallaci is not only interviewing others, she is interrogating herself. For Fallaci, the interview is a way of living and a way of existing. She writes a whole book, for example, called Letter to a Child Never Born, 1975, where she creates the persona of an unborn child for herself in order that she can have a dialogue with herself using this persona of a child that she did not deliver. Is that fiction or nonfiction? One of the characters, the unborn child, doesn't exist, but in another sense, the unborn child is an extension of the psyche of Oriana Fallaci. And the discussion is real and the issues are real. Now, when I looked up last night on Amazon, Amazon lists this book as fiction. Some of the Khomeini backstory that Fallaci tells us is agonizing. You won't believe the ordeal of doing that interview. And that's one of the interesting, fascinating aspects of studying the backstory, that that Fallaci has given us, we can see that agony that it would be missing in a news story. So some of it is agonizing, and some of it is hilarious, and is all scrupulously revealed in print. We learn how Fallaci reacts during the interview with Khomeini when she realizes her aggressive questions are being translated to Khomeini as different, harmless questions. We learn how she plans to use her hair and her clothes as political weapons in the interview. We learn that wearing a chador, the Muslim total body cloak for women, is a condition of the interview with Khomeini. And in trying to get the chador on, Oriana is forced to marry her Muslim translator in an instant marriage. It's an incredible and fascinating backstory of an interview and a lesson for us as journalists. In the end, it is the issue of the chador that provokes Khomeini to lose his temper, make himself vulnerable, and reveal himself. With Gaddafi, the instrument that provokes and reveals Gaddafi is a green pen that Fallaci uses. She just innocently pulls it out to take notes, and he explodes, and it makes him vulnerable. And I'll explain in a minute. So the Q&A format is incorporated into the backstory that helps us to understand what happened in these remarkable interviews and the remarkable other interviews that Oriana Fallaci does. The point is for you that you can make a career in journalism or a career in other things by your skill in getting access to people and your skill in conducting an interview. And you show that in your clipping file, and you show that in your job interview. So how did Fallaci do it? How did Fallaci prepare for an interview? Were her interviews successful? First, getting access to the powerful. Getting access to the scene and getting access to a person of power is a difficult problem in journalism. And it is a problem you face in doing the news story assignment of this course. The more powerful and the more knowledgeable your source, the better the story, but the more difficult the access. And so you want to challenge yourself at university to get access to powerful and knowledgeable sources. So how did Fallaci do it? How was Fallaci the first female journalist to interview Khomeini when the revolution is just 6 months old? Khomeini has just returned from exile to Iran, and 2 months later, the hostages will be seized in the U.S. embassy, starting another crisis. First, miraculously, Oriana Fallaci got the breakthrough in 8 days, and that was through a female contact that gave her the name of Bagher Salami, a translator of her books in Iran. And Salami responded in 8 days that he had arranged an interview for her with Khomeini. It's great news for Fallaci. She jumps on a plane. She arrives in Iran. And when she arrives in Iran, right away she discovers that the promise of the interview is a lie. Salami had lied to her that he'd arranged an interview with Khomeini. But she was able to get access with a high-ranking government official, and that helped her move up the ladder. And also, she wanted to do the interview to understand how to get access and how to do these difficult interviews. In the end, Fallaci was playing off two powerful political rivals in Iran who both wanted the honor of being interviewed by the hero of the interview with the Shah in order to increase their prestige. So they were lobbying Fallaci, these two men, for her to interview them. She says no to these interviews. But then one of these high-ranking officials realizes that his prestige will increase over his rivals if he brokers the interview with Khomeini. So he goes ahead and does that and is successful in arranging an interview between Fallaci and Khomeini. Fallaci doesn't realize, however, that he's also decided to be the translator in the interview so that he can do damage control and prevent any provocative questions from Fallaci reaching Khomeini. In essence, this high-ranking official is going to increase his prestige, and at the same time, he's going to manage the situation so that Fallaci can't ask her questions to Khomeini. Fallaci doesn't realize it at first, that he's not translating her questions, but harmless substitute questions. She realizes very quickly because Khomeini's answers don't make sense in terms of the questions she asked. Khomeini, she's asking, pitching Khomeini difficult, provocative questions right from the beginning. He's not reacting how she expects to these difficult questions. His answers don't fit the difficult questions. So very quickly she realizes that the high-ranking official who arranged the interview is actually now blocking the interview. And that's when she very courageously seizes control of the situation and demands a substitute translator who will translate her questions. Fallaci does not hide the fact in her account of the interview that she went in the interview seeing Khomeini as a religious tyrant who is killing his own people and taking away their rights, particularly the rights of women. In other words, she knows she is biased and she declares her bias openly. Her bias is also evident in the questions she asked Khomeini. But how will Fallaci get honest answers from her biased and judgmental questions? Will the biased and judgmental questions provoke honest answers? Remember that earlier I distinguished between judgmental and non-judgmental questions, and that you analyze your own questions very deeply to see whether there's a judgment embedded in the question or whether you can phrase the question in a way that is non-judgmental. And then I said that that both of these types of questions, judgmental and non-judgmental questions, have their use. I said that non-judgmental questions can win trust, honesty, and openness. But judgmental questions, while they can at times destroy trust, indicate dishonesty, shut down openness, shut down the interview. While judgmental questions can be an obstacle in an interview, sometimes if they're used skillfully, they can produce results, such as the famous interview of Mike Wallace interviewing Khomeini 2 months later and asking Khomeini indirectly if he was insane. So, as Fallaci prepares for interview in Iran, she decides that one of her political weapons will be her hair. The hair of women in Iran is hidden by the chador, and it is an offense for women to show their hair. Fallaci decides that she will show her hair during the interview with Khomeini as an act of rebellion to provoke and unhinge Khomeini to reveal himself. So she needs to get her hair washed and coiffed in Tehran. The problem is that the hair salons have been burned down and male hairdressers are forbidden to touch the hair of women. So it becomes a real cloak and dagger escapade for Fallaci to convince a male hairdresser in Tehran to do her hair so that she can unhinge Khomeini. The male hairdresser is terrified by this, but he agrees in the end. He pretends to lock his salon, go home, and then he sneaks back, and behind closed doors, he does Fallaci's hair. Very cloak and dagger. But all for naught. Because in the end, Fallaci can only do the interview in a chaldor that is provided by her translator, Salami. But on the way to the interview, there is no place for a lone female to change. The hotels won't allow them even to book a room for a lone female so that she can change in the chador. There are not even public washrooms for women. Fallaci's translator solves the problem of finding a space so she can change in the chador by taking her to the empty throne room of the deposed Shah. So that's got to be a very symbolic location. Fallaci is going to change into a chador to interview Khomeini in the throne room of the deposed Shah. Unfortunately, a mullah peeks into the room to see Fallaci changing the chador with the translator in the room with his back to her. This is a scandal. And the only solution on the spot is Fallaci to marry her translator with the mullah in an immediate marriage. Since the translator is Muslim, he can have more than one wife. Fallaci wants the interview so badly that she agrees to marry the translator. So imagine that situation. This is all in the backstory, things that we don't normally see in an interview, in a news story. Fallaci wants the interview so badly that she agrees to marry the translator on the spot. The interview ultimately takes 2 days in 2 parts, and Fallaci is tormented the whole time about these thoughts that she's married her translator and how on earth she's going to get out of that. After the interviews with Khomeini, with Fallaci being virtually thrown out, Fallaci learns that the marriage that she was so tormented by is not valid. What happened was that the mullah was so upset by the situation that he accidentally signed the marriage certificate twice, once as mullah and once as the groom. And Fallaci makes great use of this story, this moment of comedy, as she worries so much that she's married a translator, and then she's worried that she's married an unknown mullah. But there's really little to worry about since the mullah couldn't sign this document as groom. So with the false marriage documented, Fallaci can put the chador on and has to force her way in the holy city through a crowd of female pilgrims wanting to see Khomeini. And the crowd, women, is so frenzied with Fallaci passing through them that she takes a beating from them. Finally, Fallaci and her translator get to the room with Khomeini. That's when she discovered the high-ranking government official that arranged the interview has imposed himself as the translator. But when Fallaci realizes that this man is not translating her questions, she becomes furious, and she gets Salami, her translator, to expose the false translator. That enrages Khomeini, and the false translator is now disgraced. The son of Khomeini takes over as translator, which then gives Fallaci some leverage when the first interview breaks down. Fallaci's goal is to provoke the unprovocable Khomeini to reveal his true self. But her provocative questions risk the breakdown of the interview, and the breakdown of the interview would be unproductive. So Fallaci faces a dilemma in these provocative questions, and it requires some intellectual risk and courage for her to ask the provocative questions which could end the interview and leave her without the material. But Fallaci is skillful at this, and she's powerful because of her courage, and her courage brings her respect in those she interviews. So she's powerful because of her courage, and she's powerful because of her prominence as a female journalist. To be provoked by Fallaci would be to show fear in the face of legitimate questions, and to lose power as a man, particularly in male-dominated cultures, lose power as a man by being provoked by female journalists. So that's the leverage that Fallaci has. It's not much, but it's enough. So how did Fallaci prepare for the interview? As she prepares for the interview, Fallaci is sure of her themes and her goals. She sees Khomeini as a religious tyrant who enslaves and kills his own people and who segregates women. But she is troubled how to get Khomeini to reveal this. It will be easier to interview Gaddafi later because Gaddafi is a vain and stupid tyrant. Although at times his vanity and stupidity seem to make him impervious. But Khomeini is different. For Gaddafi, Fallaci believes he is stupid or insane, and that's what she wants to reveal. The insanity behind the power of a tyrant. That's her theme. That's what she wants to put on display. But as she starts to think about this, as she prepares for the interview, she begins to question how she defines sanity and insanity. Is she limited by her definition of sanity? And even in the midst of an interview, it's remarkable, even in the midst of an interview, Fallaci is analyzing and diagnosing herself, her behavior, and the limitations of her thinking. And this is, of course, where she gets her versatility and adaptability. Fallaci begins to falter in an interview with Gaddafi as she questions herself. She examines her own fears and anxieties, even in the midst of an interview. And that analytical ability may give her mental stability during an interview, the ability to counteract emotions that threaten to overwhelm her, and there are very emotional moments for her in these interviews. A typical tactic for Fallaci, which you might want to consider, which she will use against Gaddafi and she will use against Khomeini, is to give the person contradictions in his behavior to resolve. The way that a person resolves the contradiction reveals character and state of mind. That's an old technique in interviewing. Confronting a person with his or her own contradictions, for that person to resolve the contradiction. It's such an old technique in interviewing. It goes back to Socrates in ancient Athens 2,500 years ago. Socrates, at that time, questioned the wealthy and powerful of Athens. And remember, these are people who have a higher social status and more power than Socrates. But Socrates questions the wealthy and powerful by challenging them with contradictions and then letting them reveal themselves or defeat themselves in attempting to resolve the contradictions. Simply disputing facts in an interview can be unproductive and go nowhere. It is best to go into an interview with the basic facts at your fingertips from an uncontestable source. You need to have done your research properly. Easy, non-directive questions can be unproductive and go nowhere. Also, asking somebody, what do you think of a specific situation, can be too easy and open-ended a question for an experienced, agile person. However, that easy, non-directive question, what do you think of, can be useful if it opens up a more specific follow-up question that disputes the easy first answer. So that's a tactic you might want to try, particularly with a difficult subject. You pitch the easy, non-directive question first, but you're fully prepared and you're going to dig in with the follow-up questions. Fallaci does this same tactic of formulating a question with a provocative contradiction. For example, how can you say you are liberating people if you segregate women in Iran and don't allow them to go to university? How can you say you're bringing law and justice to Iran if you basically have trials where people are presumed guilty at the beginning? Those are the types of questions Fallaci pitches to Khomeini. They are contradictions, provocative contradictions, and she hopes that Khomeini will get tangled up in trying to deal with the contradiction and reveal himself. So when you give someone a question, there's a provocative contradiction. The way the person resolves the contradiction should reveal character and state of mind. With Gaddafi, the interview, Gaddafi seems to be so isolated in his own mind that he seems impervious. Until, during the interview, Oriana Fallaci pulls a green pen out to jot down a question she's formulating so that she won't forget the question. For some reason, Gaddafi is obsessed with the appearance of the green pen, and it develops that it's because the pen is the same color as his green book. This green book is Gaddafi's theory of revolution and progress. And as Fallaci talks about it, Gaddafi has huge pride in the intellectual depth of this green book, which is actually quite absurd and shallow. Now, the incident with the green pen is something that Fallaci didn't anticipate, as she didn't anticipate how she would turn the chatter with Khomeini into a political weapon against him during the interview. With Khomeini, because Fallaci consents to wear the chatter, which she considers an insult and form of imprisonment for women, she's initially lost the political advantage of her hair. And remember all the trouble she went to, that cloak and dagger escapade, to get her hair washed so she could flaunt her hair. And now she's consented to hide her hair with the chatter. And so in wearing the chatter, Fallaci, in a sense, has submitted to the power of Khomeini by wearing the chatter and what is happening to the women of Iran. Fallaci walks into the interview expecting to deal with a religious tyrant that she abhors as tyrants, and right away she feels herself seduced. That's the word that she uses, seduced. Seduced by his composure and dignity and certainty. She calls this rare weapons, and she identifies his serenity and his imperturbability. How on earth is she going to get him to reveal himself? Fallaci in the interview finds a symbol of the imperturbability of Khomeini with a marvelous detail about a fly that lands at Khomeini during the interview. The fly lands at Khomeini, but he does not react. The fly crawls across Khomeini's skin, and he does not react. The fly crawls into his beard, and she does not react. He is serene and can't be imperturbable. So Fallaci loses power, and she feels more submissive. She says he had an, quote, enigmatic charisma and an old patriarch's charm, end quote. She calls him her enemy, and she feels herself disarmed in his presence. She wonders if she has the courage, she tells us, to persevere against him and resist his charismatic effect on her. Think about how you feel in an interview. When you go into an interview, particularly with a powerful person, a knowledgeable person, an expert, do you feel courageous? Do you feel powerful? Are you intimidated by the power and knowledge and expertise of the person you were interviewed? Do you avoid questions because you feel intimidated? After the interview, do you say, "Oh, I should have asked that question. Why didn't I ask that question?" But you were confused in the interview and you felt intimidated. Not Oriana Fallaci. In the interview with Khomeini, Fallaci realizes that her provocative questions are getting nowhere. This guy can't be disturbed. She also realizes how she's getting angry at moments and frustrated. And of course, the problem for her is that her own emotions can lead her to lose her intellectual balance as an interview. Khomeini remains calm and unprovoked. She is getting angry and frustrated. And his answers make perfect sense from his cultural perspective. And she realizes that. She realizes that from his cultural perspective, his answers make perfect sense. She also has to agree with him that the West has its moments of evil, such as the Christian crusades against Muslims. And she spends some time in the backstory, talking about recognizing the moments of evil of the West. Fallaci also feels trapped in the interview. Provocative questions with Khomeini lead to calm answers that make rational sense from his cultural perspective and his religious point of view. She realizes she can't trap him in a lie because he believes what he says. Now, she reaches the point where she does think she has him on the defensive, but even on the defensive, she realizes Khomeini is still deflecting her skillfully and defeating her. He is revealing nothing but vague platitudes. So imagine yourself doing an interview, and you start to feel intimidated. You start to feel outclassed by the experience and the skill of the person you're interviewing. You realize that you're not getting straight answers, but you don't know how to stop that from happening. You don't know how to turn the interview around. And so that's what we want to watch in Oriana Fallaci, how in the midst of an interview where she realizes she's getting nowhere, she's just getting vague platitudes. And as a journalist, the interview from her perspective is going to be worthless if all she comes away with vague platitudes that reinforce what she believes is an evil tyranny. How good a journalist if that's all she gets out of the interview. Now, Khomeini is quite intelligent because right away, Khomeini sees the trap of the context in her questions, and during the interview, Khomeini identifies the trap in her context of questions and says, I'm not going to be go into that trap. Instead of provoking him instead of Fallaci succeeding in provoking him, Khomeini argues against her context, a context which he knows is deliberately provocative. He simply disputes the context of his questions. So imagine yourself in that situation. You are doing an interview, you have great questions with context, but the person you're interviewing is evading the answer by disputing the context of your questions. If that happens, you want to be able to identify to yourself very quickly that this is happening, and you want to think, how do you get out of that problem of a useless interview where all you get is a dispute about your questions? Khomeini is turning Fallaci's skill in provoking people against her and deflating her. Fallaci realizes her strategy of the provocative context of her questions isn't working. So what does she do? She changes and adapts right during the interview. She reverts to a simple non-directive question. The type of question that I've said before is a question that doesn't work well for somebody as skillful. But this is what Fallaci does, and she does it quite deliberately. She does it quite skillfully. She reverts to a simple non-directive question. She asks Khomeini, what is freedom? Now, there's no provocative context in that question. What is freedom? It's a non-directive question, and what she's hoping for is it will turn the tables, because now he will provide the context and she will start to dispute his context. So what is freedom? That leaves Khomeini free to state the context. And like I said, Fallaci will argue against context, and now Khomeini has to defend his own context. He has to defend his definition of freedom. So Khomeini starts his definition of freedom, and like all definitions, it's general and thus vulnerable to particular exceptions. So Khomeini gets this law ball pitch, the non-directive question, the general question, what is freedom? And he gives an answer, and Fallaci starts chipping away by asking him to explain the apparent exceptions to his definition of freedom in Iran. Now, if Fallaci can provoke an angry answer, she will have a revelation, because the angry answer, the person will reveal himself or herself. Think of the interview with Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau in 1970, when Trudeau has invoked the War Measures Act and suspended civil liberty. And I played that interview with you previously, and I posted it on Moodle for you. In that interview, impromptu interview, the reporters used the tactic of trying to provoke Trudeau with the contradiction between his belief in justice and civil liberty and invoking the War Measures Act. So the dynamic of that interview that the journalists are using is a contradiction. And Trudeau enjoys debating the reporters. He wants to show their hypocrisy, so he tries to turn around it to a contradiction in them. So we've got this game of contradictions going on. Finally, what we see that Trudeau is overwhelmed by the pressure of the contradictions and the way the reporters dare him. He gets emotional and he gets angry, and he says that famous comment, "Just watch me." Back to Khomeini. The interview with Khomeini may be going in Fallaci's favor if she can unhinge Khomeini with contradictions to his concept of justice and freedom. So, she starts after this initial question, what is freedom? Then she responds with exceptions to that and how we resolve the contradiction. So she says, well, if you talk about justice and freedom, what about the politicians put to death? And the response of Khomeini is confident. The evil are already guilty. So Fallaci doesn't give up. And then she finds the next vulnerable question. And this is the point where she really turns it around. And she finds the vulnerable question. Since evil people are put to death, what about forgiveness? She asks. As a priest, have you ever forgiven anybody? Do you feel pity? Have you ever cried? That Khomeini is in trouble now with these questions. He knows he's in trouble. He knows he's caught in a contradiction of humanity. And he tries to, his solution is to try to end the interview. But Fallaci is stubborn and insistent, and there's still this veneer of civility and politeness that you in the way you end an interview, and that's the last thread she can hold on to. So Khomeini is ready to bolt because of these questions. Since evil people are put to death, what about forgiveness? As a priest, have you ever forgiven anybody? Do you feel pity? Have you ever cried? There's questions about the humanity of Khomeini that will be a contradiction to his firm absolute positions. So Fallaci is holding on to the thread of the interview. Khomeini is trying to split. And it's that point that the chadar becomes a political weapon. Now, the chadar had been used in the interview with Khomeini as a symbol of the contradiction of the claim of freedom and equality in Iran. How are women free and equal if they are forced to wear the chadar? And she said in the interview. Now, she asked that question again, and the question makes Khomeini angry. And this is something that breaks the demeanor of Khomeini that has allowed him to maintain control. Khomeini tries to turn that question against Fallaci by saying that if she doesn't want to wear it, she doesn't have to, since only young and respectable women wear it. The implication, of course, which is obvious to Fallaci, is that she is not young and respectable. And to make it worse, Khomeini starts to laugh at her, makes her feel humiliated, he feels he's humiliated her, and all the men in the room are laughing at Fallaci. And Fallaci feels humiliated and furious. So what does she do? Fallaci tears off her chadar and she throws it on the ground. She treats Khomeini with scorn and she says, "Thank you, Mr. Khomeini. You are so polite, a real gentleman. I'll take this stupid medieval rag off," end quote. Fallaci has turned Khomeini's insult into a bigger insult. She has used the chadar as a political weapon against Khomeini. He leaves immediately without a word. So she's thrown down the chadar. It's like saying thrown down the gauntlet. She's thrown down the gauntlet literally in the chadar. Khomeini has leaves without a word. All the men in the room are shocked. They tell Fallaci that the interview is over. Again, Fallaci is insistent. She insists the interview is not finished. The son of Khomeini then has to shuttle back and forth between Khomeini, his father, and Fallaci, trying to see if the Khomeini will agree to continue the interview. Fallaci refuses to leave, and she threatens to tell the world that Khomeini threw her out if they don't do something about it. So the son of Khomeini enlists his mother and the wife of Khomeini. She's brought in to negotiate, and finally it's agreed that Fallaci can return for 30 minutes the next day. Phew. So for the second interview, in revenge, the next day, Fallaci returns without the chadar. Khomeini is now more vulnerable. Fallaci starts to ask Khomeini whether if the West is so evil, why do they use Western inventions? Khomeini starts to concede that not everything in the West is evil. His absolute position is breaking down. Then she asks, don't you think there could be something good in us? Again, that's an appeal to the humanity and rationality of Khomeini, who's been maintaining these really absolute positions. It's like her previous question, asking Khomeini if he ever felt forgiveness, pity, tears. It is a question that probes his humanity, the humanity of Islam. His reaction is that he looks at Fallaci if he's been hit. His head flips down and his turban tumbles off and rolls onto the ground. Now the veil is torn. Khomeini is furious, but Fallaci is also feeling a bit guilty. She's angry with Khomeini, and that she feels that she's mistreated him at the same time. He seems more lenient to return, more expansive, but he smiles as though he's been vindicated. He rises to leave and end the interview. Then Fallaci, ever insistent, makes a derogatory statement about what she sees as wrong in Iran, and taunted, his voice becomes thunder, and he blames the West again. And remember, this is the mask torn from this calm, serene, wise religious leader. He's lost his composure, and 2 months later, the hostages are taken at the American embassy in Tehran. Is this successful? Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you would arrive at a sense of whether this interview is successful or not. Certainly, Fallaci does not exit the interview with the usual superficial platitudes. She's able to provoke Khomeini, and that in itself is revealing. He is stumped by the question about humanity, about forgiveness, about pity, about crying. He tries to indicate it's there with him, but it's something that unhinges him. And during the second interview, the shorter interview, Fallaci tries to return to that, and it's he moderates his position, but in the end he still is absolute. So is the interview successful? I can't say definitively, but what I can say is, in the end, the success of Fallaci is, if it is success, comes from her fearless persistence, her ability to analyze and adapt during the interview. And the symbol of the chadar, which at first put her in a submissive position she was uncomfortable with, because what it symbolizes for women and freedom for women, that is something she uses to provoke Khomeini to justify his contradictions morally. After she leaves and the interview is published, Khomeini publicly denounces Fallaci. And he didn't have to do that, but he's angry, so he denounces Fallaci. And posters with her picture denouncing her were posted all over Tehran. Her translator, Salami, the guy with the false marriage, he turns against her, and he publishes a false account in Iran of the interview, that a version that's to the advantage of Khomeini. And as I said, 2 weeks later, there's the hostage incident. Mike Wallace interviews Khomeini in Tehran and finds a way to ask Khomeini why he's seen is crazy. After the interview with Khomeini, Fallaci feels confused and depressed, and she decides to try and work that out personally by interviewing the madman Gaddafi. Remember, her husband had died in 1976, and then her mother had cancer and died. And for years, she was mourning the death of her husband, abstained from journalism. Then she plunges back into journalism, plunges back to life and world affairs as she tries to understand her own pain and doubt about her life by these remarkable interviews with Gaddafi and Khomeini.